The grenade hit 3 meters from the vehicle, and Corporal Willie Apiata, 28 years old, member of the New Zealand Special Air Service, had less than 2 seconds before the explosion would either kill him instantly or leave him bleeding out in the Afghan darkness, 70 meters from his team, surrounded by 20 insurgents who had spent the entire day planning exactly how to kill every man in his unit. The night had started quiet, the kind of quiet that experienced soldiers learn to distrust. Apiata and his patrol had established a temporary position in the Bamyan province, central Afghanistan, a landscape of ancient valleys and mountains that had swallowed armies for 3,000 years. The date was August 4th, 2004. The temperature had dropped to near freezing. Apiata sat in the rear of a Pinzgauer military vehicle, checking his weapon for the 7th time that evening, a ritual born not from regulation, but from the superstition that keeps soldiers alive. He could see his breath in the thin mountain air. Beside him sat Corporal D, whose real name would remain classified for another decade, a close friend, a man Willie had trained beside for 2 years, someone who knew the names of Willie's family back in New Zealand, who had shared cigarettes and stories during countless nights exactly like this one. Willie Apiata had grown up in the small community of Te Kaha on New Zealand's North Island, a coastal Maori settlement where the ocean was both provider and teacher. His family were not wealthy. His father worked hard jobs. His mother held the family together with strength that Willie would only fully understand years later, when he found himself in situations where strength was the only currency that mattered. Willie had joined the army at 19, not running from something but running toward it, searching for purpose in a world that offered young Maori men limited paths to prove themselves. The Special Air Service had been a dream that seemed impossibly distant, an elite unit that accepted fewer than 10% of candidates, where the selection course alone broke men who considered themselves unbreakable. Willie had passed. He had endured the mountains, the sleep deprivation, the psychological pressure designed to reveal who would quit when everything inside them screamed to stop. He had not quit. The first explosion shattered the night at 2200 hours exactly. The grenade struck the rear of the Pinzgauer where Willie and Corporal D sat exposed. The world became light and sound and force. Willie felt himself lifted, thrown, the ground rushing up to meet him with the hardness that only Afghan rock possesses. His ears registered nothing but a high-pitched whine. His vision blurred. He tasted blood and dust. Training took over before conscious thought could catch up. Roll, assess, weapon, cover. His rifle was still in his hands. Muscle memory had ensured that. He scrambled behind a boulder, breath coming in ragged gasps, and tried to understand what had just happened. The Pinzgauer was destroyed, metal twisted, flames beginning to curl from the engine. Automatic weapons fire erupted from the ridgeline 200 meters north. Tracers cut through the darkness like deadly stars. Willie counted muzzle flashes. 5, 7, 10, more. The ambush was coordinated, professional, the kind of attack that suggested the insurgents had been watching, learning, waiting for exactly this moment of vulnerability. Willie's team returned fire, the distinctive crack of their weapons creating a desperate symphony of survival. But something was wrong. Willie scanned the burning vehicle and the scattered positions of his unit. Corporal D was missing. Willie found him 30 meters away, partially concealed behind scattered rocks, not moving. D had been closer to the grenade impact. The blast had thrown him further, harder. Willie low-crawled across the open ground, every meter an eternity, expecting the bullet that would end the crawl permanently. He reached D and immediately saw the damage. Shrapnel had torn through D's legs and lower torso. Blood, black in the darkness, pooled beneath him. D's eyes were open but unfocused, his breathing shallow and rapid, the body's desperate attempt to compensate for massive blood loss. Willie pressed his hands against the worst wounds, feeling the hot pulse of arterial bleeding that meant minutes, not hours. "Stay with me, brother," Willie whispered, though he knew D probably could not hear him over the gunfire. Willie glanced back toward the main defensive position where the rest of his unit had established a firing line. 70 meters. It might as well have been 70 kilometers. Between Willie's position and safety lay open ground. illuminated periodically by muzzle flashes and the burning vehicle, a killing field with overlapping lines of fire from both the insurgents and his own team's defensive position. Moving through that space meant crossing the exact terrain where every bullet was traveling, where the insurgents had pre-ranged their weapons, where simple mathematics said survival was statistically impossible. Willie had three options. First, stay in position, apply pressure to D's wounds, and call for the medic to come to them. But the medic was pinned down, returning fire, and D's bleeding suggested he had perhaps 10 minutes before shock and blood loss made Jew rescue meaningless. Second, leave D temporarily, sprint back to the main position, and organize a coordinated rescue with covering fire. But leaving D meant watching him potentially bleed out alone, and the time required to organize and execute such a plan might exceed D's remaining minutes. Third, carry D himself, immediately, across the 70 meters of death. The training said, call for help. The protocol said, establish security first. The manual said, never expose yourself unnecessarily. But Willie Apiata had been raised in a culture where the concept of wanao meant family not by blood, but by bond, where the ancient Maori value of kaitiakitanga meant guardianship, protection, an obligation that transcended personal safety. The New Zealand Special Air Service had reinforced these values, not replacing them, but channeling them into military doctrine. No man left behind was not merely a saying, but an absolute law, a covenant that defined who they were. Willie made his decision in the space between two heartbeats. He reached down, grabbed D's tactical vest with both hands, and pulled his unconscious friend onto his shoulders in a fireman's carry. D weighed approximately 80 kilograms plus full combat equipment. Willie himself had been partially injured in the initial blast, his ribs bruised, possibly cracked, his left shoulder bleeding from shrapnel wounds he had not yet acknowledged. The weight settled onto him like judgment. He stood up, fully exposed, silhouetted against the burning vehicle. Every insurgent on that ridgeline could see him. Every weapon could range him. Willie began to walk, not run. Running meant bouncing D, risking dropping him, losing precious seconds if he stumbled on the rocky terrain. Walking meant control, balance, certainty. Walking also meant maximum exposure time. 70 meters at walking pace under fire meant approximately 1 minute of being the easiest target in the Afghan theater of war. The first bullets arrived within 3 seconds. Willie heard the distinctive crack snap of rounds passing close enough to feel the air displacement. Dust exploded at his feet, where a burst stitched the ground centimeters from his boots. His own team, recognizing what was happening, intensified their covering fire, trying to suppress the insurgent positions, trying to give Willie a chance that arithmetic said he did not have. The night became a storm of sound. AK-47 fire, sharp and rapid. M4 carbines responding with controlled bursts. The deeper thud of belt-fed machine guns, RPG explosions. And through it all, Willie's breathing, labored and steady, counting steps, refusing to acknowledge the mathematics of death happening around him. At 20 meters, Willie's left leg buckled. A rock turned beneath his boot, his ankle twisting with a pain that shot up his leg like electricity. D's weight shifted, nearly spilling off Willie's shoulders. Willie adjusted, redistributed, kept moving. Sweat poured down his face despite the freezing temperature. His hands locked around D's vest and belt had gone numb. His shoulders screamed. His ribs felt like they were grinding together with each step. 30 meters, 40 meters. A round struck the ground so close that rock fragments peppered Willie's leg. He did not pause. He could see faces now. His teammates providing covering fire, faces tight with fear and admiration, knowing exactly what they were witnessing, understanding the impossible audacity of what Willie was attempting. 50 meters, 60 meters. Willie's vision narrowed to a tunnel. His entire world became the next step, then the next, then the next. The weight seemed to double. His legs trembled. His back felt like it would snap. His mind offered him 1,000 rational reasons to drop D, take cover, save himself. He ignored everyone. At 65 meters, Willie felt a tremendous impact against D's body armor. the unmistakable sensation of a bullet finding its target. For a terrible moment, Willie thought D had been hit again, that he was carrying a dead man through fire. But D groaned, a sound that meant pain, which meant alive. The round had struck D's armor plate, not penetrating but transferring enough blunt force trauma to jar him into semi-consciousness. Willie adjusted his grip and took another step. 70 meters. Hands reached out, pulling D from Willie's shoulders, dragging both men behind the defensive barrier. The medic was there immediately, cutting away D's gear, working with the practiced speed that meant the difference between casualty and fatality. Willie collapsed, his legs finally giving out, his lungs burning, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. Someone pressed a water bottle into his hands. Someone else was checking him for wounds. Willie waved them away, his eyes locked on the medic working on D, watching for the signs that would indicate whether the last minute had been sacrifice or suicide. The firefight continued for another 40 minutes. The insurgents, realizing their ambush had failed to achieve the catastrophic casualties they had planned, withdrew into the mountains using routes they had prepared in advance. Willie's unit called in helicopter support, established a secure perimeter, and evacuated their wounded. Corporal D survived the night. He would spend 3 months in hospitals, undergoing multiple surgeries, but he survived. The doctors later stated that without immediate pressure on his wounds and rapid evacuation to the main position where proper medical equipment was available, D would have died from blood loss within 15 minutes of the initial blast. Willie Apiata did not speak about what he had done. In the days following the contact, he filed his after-action report with the same clinical precision he applied to every mission. His teammates knew, his commanders knew. But within the culture of the Special Air Service, heroism was not celebrated with speeches, but with silence, with the quiet acknowledgement between professionals who understood that extraordinary action in crisis was not exceptionalism, but expectation. The New Zealand Defence Force, however, recognized that what Willie had done transcended normal military valor. On June 26, 2007, nearly 3 years after that August night, Willie Apiata was awarded the Victoria Cross for New Zealand, the highest military decoration for valor in the presence of the enemy. He was the first person to receive this honor since the award's institution. The citation described his actions with careful understatement, the military's way of documenting events that defy adequate description. Willie attended the ceremony in full dress uniform, his face composed, accepting the medal not as personal achievement, but as recognition of every soldier who had trained him, fought beside him, and instilled in him the values that made retreat impossible. American Marines and soldiers who served alongside the New Zealand Special Air Service in Afghanistan spoke about them with a particular tone, a mixture of respect and something deeper. One United States Marine Corps officer, speaking years later on condition of anonymity as per protocol, described watching NZSAS operators prepare for a direct action mission. They were quiet, the Marine said. Not the Hollywood quiet, not the dramatic silence before violence. Just focused. No wasted movement. No bravado. They checked their gear with the attention most people reserve for defusing bombs. When the brief came down, they asked 3 questions, all tactical, all relevant. Then they went out and did things that made you reconsider what you thought was possible. Another American soldier, a veteran of multiple deployments, recounted a joint operation in Helmand Province, where NZSAS and United States Army Rangers were tasked with clearing a compound known to house high-value insurgent targets. "We were good," the soldier said. "We knew we were good. Then we watched the Kiwis work. They moved through that compound like they had built it themselves. Every corner, every room, textbook perfect but faster than should be possible. Zero panic, zero hesitation. When we hit resistance, they adjusted in real time. No shouting, just hand signals and immediate action. Afterward, their team leader asked if we needed anything, like they had just finished a routine patrol instead of a close-quarters gunfight. That was when I understood the difference between being good and being elite." The reputation was built on consistent performance across 2 decades of deployment. The NZSAS selection course, though modeled on the British SAS program, had evolved to reflect New Zealand's unique military culture. Candidates faced mountains that would kill the unprepared, forests that swallowed the lost, and psychological pressure designed to strip away everything except the core of who they were. The pass rate hovered around 10%. Those who passed were not necessarily the strongest or the fastest, but the ones who demonstrated one critical characteristic. They continued when continuation seemed impossible. Willie Apiata had been one of those 10%. The Victoria Cross changed Willie's life in ways he had not anticipated and did not particularly want. He became public, a face attached to a community that valued anonymity. New Zealand media covered the award extensively. Politicians invoked his name. Schools invited him to speak. Willie navigated this new terrain with the same quiet competence he applied to combat operations, understanding that his visibility served a purpose beyond himself, representing not just the NZSAS, but every soldier who served without recognition, every act of courage that occurred in darkness and remained there. But the medal also carried weight. Willie began experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress, the delayed cost of multiple deployments, and the specific burden of that August night. The memory of Dee's blood on his hands, the sound of bullets that should have killed him, the knowledge that millimeters and milliseconds had separated survival from death. He sought help quietly through military channels, and slowly learned that strength included acknowledging when the weight became too much to carry alone. In doing so, he offered another form of leadership, demonstrating that admitting psychological wounds did not diminish the valor that earned them. Corporal D, whose identity remained protected, recovered sufficiently to return to limited military duties. He and Willie maintained their friendship, though they rarely spoke directly about that night. The bond between them required no verbal acknowledgement. D later told a close family member, in one of the few times he discussed the incident, "Willie gave me every day I've had since then. My children exist because he decided I was worth dying for. How do you thank someone for that? You don't. You just try to live in a way that honors it." The broader impact of Willie's actions extended beyond personal relationships. Within the New Zealand Special Air Service, the incident became part of the unwritten curriculum, not taught in formal classes, but transmitted through the culture. New operators learned about Willie not through mandatory lectures, but through the stories told during long nights, through the casual comments from senior members about what the unit expected, about the covenant between operators that made the NZSAS different. The lesson was not be like Willie Apiata, but rather understand what we do when brothers fall. American Special Operations Forces who worked with the NZSAS absorbed this culture through observation. A United States Navy SEAL, speaking at a professional development conference years after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, described the New Zealand approach. They punched way above their weight class. New Zealand is a country of 5 million people. They fielded maybe 100 NZSAS operators in theater at any given time, but they took missions that other nations assigned to units 3 times that size, and they succeeded. Not sometimes, consistently. You learned quickly that when the Kiwis said they would handle something, it was handled. That reliability, that consistency of performance under impossible conditions, that is what separates good units from legendary ones. The statistical reality supported these observations. The NZSAS operated in Afghanistan from late 2001 through 2005, then again from 2009 through 2012. They conducted reconnaissance missions in areas where intelligence was minimal and enemy presence was guaranteed. They performed direct action raids against high-value targets with success rates that military analysts studied for lessons applicable to broader special operations doctrine. They trained Afghan special forces, transferring skills and mindset to local operators who would continue the fight after international forces withdrew. And they did this with casualty rates far lower than statistical models predicted, not through caution, but through excellence. Willie Apiata eventually transitioned from active service, though he remained connected to the military community. He worked in veteran support roles, using his public profile to advocate for soldiers struggling with reintegration, homelessness, and mental health challenges. He participated in Anzac Day ceremonies, standing with aging veterans of earlier wars, representing a new generation of New Zealand warriors who had written their own chapters in the long history of service. He married, had children, and attempted to build a life where being Willie Apiata the man was possible, alongside being Willie Apiata the symbol. The children who grew up hearing about Willie's Victoria Cross, who saw his image in textbooks and museums, learned a particular narrative about heroism. But the adults who knew him, who served with him, or encountered him in his post-military life, understood a more complex truth. Heroism was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear's rational warnings. Courage was not feeling invincible, but feeling terrified and moving forward anyway. Loyalty meant accepting that some bonds demanded you risk everything, that some promises could only be kept through sacrifice that made no logical sense. The New Zealand Special Air Service continued its operations, its members rotating through deployments, conducting missions that would never be publicly acknowledged, building a reputation one successful operation at a time. They remained small, selective, quietly professional. When international military conferences gathered special operations forces from dozens of nations, the NZSAS representatives were often among the quietest in the room, speaking little, observing much, and earning respect not through self-promotion, but through the accumulated weight of their unit's performance over decades. American Marines and soldiers who deployed to Afghanistan in the years following Willie's Victoria Cross sometimes heard the story from their New Zealand counterparts, usually late at night, usually when trust had been established through shared hardship. The Americans would listen, then sit quietly, processing what they had heard. Some would ask questions, others would simply nod, understanding that some actions transcended nationality or flag, that courage spoke a universal language, that the decision Willie made in those terrible seconds represented the best of what military service could demand and what human beings could deliver. Willie Apiata's Victoria Cross sits now in the Army Museum in Waihuru, New Zealand, displayed alongside the decorations of previous generations. Visitors, mostly civilians, pause before the exhibit, reading the citation, examining the medal, trying to comprehend what 70 meters under fire means, what carrying 80 kilograms through a bullet storm requires. Most cannot. The experience exists beyond imagination for those who have not stood in darkness with death whispering offers of survival in exchange for abandoning the wounded. But they sense something in the simple facts of the citation, something that speaks to fundamental questions about human nature, about what we owe each other, about the distance between who we think we are and who we become when everything depends on the next decision. Corporal D lived to see his children grow. He watched them graduate school, learn to drive, fall in love, make their own choices about service and sacrifice. At family gatherings, when his children asked about his military service, he spoke carefully, protecting classified details, but occasionally he would pause and say something like, "I served with the best men I ever met. They taught me what loyalty means. Real loyalty, not the word, but the action." His children did not know for many years that they existed because of 70 meters their father did not walk himself, because Willie Apiata had decided that some mathematics override survival instinct. The insurgents who planned that August ambush had intelligence, training, and tactical advantage. They chose the location carefully. They coordinated their timing precisely. They executed their attack professionally, and they failed, not because of superior firepower or technological advantage, but because one man made a choice that their planning had assumed was impossible. No rational soldier would cross 70 meters of fire carrying a wounded comrade. The insurgents had calculated human nature and found their calculations insufficient. Willie Apiata had operated beyond calculation. Years later, when journalists asked Willie about that night, he typically deflected. "I did what anyone in the unit would have done," became his standard response. Those who knew him understood this was not false modesty, but genuine belief. Within the NZSAS culture, Willie's action was not exceptional, but definitional. It was what you did. The medal recognized the action, but the action itself was simply adherence to the code that every operator internalized during selection, training, and service. Leave no one behind was not aspirational. It was operational. But the American Marines and soldiers who witnessed the NZSAS in action understood something. Willie perhaps did not fully grasp about his own significance. Excellence requires examples. Standards require demonstration. Saying we never leave anyone behind is doctrine. Carrying someone 70 meters through crossfire is proof. Willie had provided proof. He had transformed abstract values into concrete action that could be witnessed, documented, and transmitted. He had shown a generation of warriors, from New Zealand and beyond, what the standard actually looked like when stripped of hypothetical discussion and confronted with immediate choice. The legacy continues. Today's NZSAS operators, many of whom were children when Willie earned his Victoria Cross, train under the same selection process, deploy to the same dangerous regions, and maintain the same reputation for quiet competence that their predecessors established. They know Willie's story not as ancient history but as living example. When they face impossible situations, when the easy choice conflicts with the right choice, they have a template. Not a guarantee of survival, not a promise that courage will be rewarded, but evidence that humans can function beyond what fear predicts, that loyalty can override self-preservation, that 70 meters can be crossed. The United States military, with its vast resources and extensive special operations community, watches smaller allied units with interest. The question that analysts repeatedly examine is simple. How do nations with limited populations and budgets produce elite forces that perform at or above the level of units with exponentially greater resources? The answer, as American officers who worked with the NZSAS discovered, involves culture as much as capability. New Zealand selects for character traits that cannot be taught. They train to standards that accept high failure rates to ensure those who pass possess not just skills, but mindset. They build units where reputation is collective, where individual achievement matters less than team success, where humility is valued as highly as competence. Willie Apiata embodied this culture. He grew up in a community where collective welfare outweighed individual advancement. He joined a military that reinforced these values. He served in a unit that made them operational, and when crisis came, when 2 seconds of decision would determine whether his friend lived or died, whether he would be remembered for courage or caution, all of that cultural preparation compressed into instinctive action. He did not deliberate. He did not calculate odds. He acted according to who he was, who his culture had shaped him to be, who his training had refined him into. The Victoria Cross for New Zealand that Willie received was the first awarded under that specific honor's new charter. It will not be the last. Future New Zealand soldiers will face their own moments of impossible choice, their own seconds where values conflict with survival. Some will earn recognition. Most will not. But all will operate within the legacy that Willie and others like him have built. The accumulated weight of examples that define what New Zealand military service means, what the Special Air Service represents, what can be demanded when everything is at stake. The American Marines who watched NZSAS operators arrive at forward operating bases throughout Afghanistan saw professionals. They saw disciplined soldiers who executed missions with precision. But those who looked closer, who spent time talking with the New Zealanders, who observed not just their tactical performance but their interactions with each other, saw something deeper. They saw a unit culture where the bond between operators was not metaphorical but literal, where brother was not casual term, but sacred obligation, where the promise to never abandon each other was tested repeatedly and never broken. This was what made the difference. This was what the Marines witnessed when NZSAS arrived. Not superior weapons or advanced technology, not tactical innovations or strategic genius, but men who had decided, long before arriving in theater, that certain principles were non-negotiable, that loyalty to each other transcended orders or odds, that when crisis came they would not calculate but act, not preserve themselves but protect each other, not survive but prevail together, or not at all. Willie Apiata carried Corporal D 70 meters through fire and gave him a future. But the act itself carried further, across years and borders, into the consciousness of every soldier who heard the story and understood its implications. Courage is contagious. Excellence is learnable. Standards can be maintained across generations if the examples are clear enough, the values strong enough, the culture resilient enough. On August 4, 2004, in a valley in Afghanistan that most people will never see, under a sky filled with bullets and tracers, Willie Apiata demonstrated what one man could do when everything inside him said stop, but something deeper said continue. 70 meters, 80 kilograms, 1 minute, one life saved, one standard set, one promise kept. And that, more than any doctrine or manual or regulation, is what the Americans witnessed when the NZSAS arrived. They saw proof that heroism was not mythology but choice, that sacrifice was not ancient history but present reality, that the values every military claims to uphold could be, when tested by fire and darkness and impossible odds, actually lived. Willie Apiata died. No, that is not accurate. Willie Apiata lives still, carrying the weight of that night in ways visible and invisible, managing the cost of courage that does not end when the bullets stop, navigating a life that became public when he preferred private, representing standards he considers unremarkable that others find extraordinary. He works, he mentors, he serves in different capacities now, still adhering to the values that defined that August night, still believing that what he did was simply what anyone should do, still uncomfortable with attention that he never sought. But Corporal D lives too, and D's children, and the countless soldiers who heard the story and understood that elite service demands more than skill, that special operations requires not just capability, but character, that the distance between ordinary and extraordinary is often measured not in talent, but in decision, in the terrible seconds where you choose between what fear advises and what loyalty demands. 70 meters. That is the distance Willie Apiata walked carrying his friend through crossfire. But it is also the distance between doctrine and demonstration, between claiming values and proving them, between saying you will never abandon your brothers and actually carrying them home when every instinct screams to save yourself. That distance can only be crossed one step at a time, with weight on your shoulders and bullets in the air, and nothing but conviction to keep moving forward. The New Zealand Special Air Service motto, inherited from their British counterparts, is simple: who dares wins. Willie Apiata dared. Corporal D won his life, and everyone who witnessed it, everyone who heard the story, everyone who understood its implications, won something too. They won proof that humans can be better than fear predicts, that loyalty can override logic, that 70 meters of impossible terrain can be crossed if the person on your shoulders matters more than the bullets in the air. That is what the Americans witnessed. That is what they testified to. That is what Willie Apiata demonstrated on one night in Afghanistan, that echoes still through every special operations community that values courage over caution, brothers over self, mission over survival. Not because such values are easy, but because they are essential. Not because they guarantee success, but because they define what success means. Not because everyone will make the same choice Willie made, but because knowing someone did, knowing it is possible, knowing the standard exists, changes what we believe ourselves capable of becoming. If this story reminded you why we tell these histories, why we remember these names, why we honor these actions, consider sharing it. Like this video if courage measured in meters and minutes resonates with you. Subscribe if you believe that the distance between who we are and who we could be is often crossed, not through grand gestures, but through the terrible, beautiful decision to take one more step when everything says stop, to carry one more meter when arms fail, to continue one more second when logic demands retreat. Because that is how standards are set. That is how legacies are built. That is how we remember that honor is not words on a page but weight on shoulders, carried through fire. across 70 meters that separate ordinary from extraordinary, survival from sacrifice, living from living with purpose.